thought the outgoing professor was you, and I thought you had your own mic.
No, I do that. Yeah, no problem. All right. It's time to get started again. And we're going to start with a little movie clip from the movie that Roger Ebert said was the best movie of 1998, and yet most of you have never heard of this movie. The movie is Dark City, and, well, we'll just watch.
Of unhappy childhood. A dash of teenage rebellion. And last but not least, a tragic death in the family. Doctor?
Frederick says he'll take me off the damn night shift soon.
Well, it's about time, dear.
Okay, just to give you a little context. So basically, there are a bunch of aliens who have come down, and they are trying to basically understand the human soul. Okay? And they have this capacity where every night at midnight, they essentially stop time and everyone falls unconscious except for two people. The one guy who's walking around looking totally confused, and Donald Sutherland, who works for them. Sorry, Kiefer Sutherland, who works for them. And so you'll get a sense of what they're doing when they put everyone to sleep.
Once we have maze quarters for the night through.
He made a terrible impression for the firm, lollygagging around as he did. So I simply told Frederickson I was going to have to let him go.
And well, you should have done.
Okay, so the point of this is twofold. One is that these aliens, essentially, in some way that we don't understand, are going in and changing, essentially, the psychological DNA of all these people while they're asleep, unconscious, whatever it is. Okay? And turning them into different people with different selves. Right? So the couple that you saw there at the beginning of the clip were sort of a poor couple struggling in a small little apartment, and he was hoping to get off the night shift soon. And then they change everything about them, their home, their finances, their internal psychological material, and at the end, they wake up in this sort of wealthy condominium with, all the luxuries that you could imagine, and they go forward as if nothing had happened whatsoever, and they had always been the well-to-do folks that they currently now are. Okay. So we're going to skip some things here. Okay, so this is from the movie Dark City. And so I guess my question for all of you, and the real reason I show this, okay, is to ask you how any of you can be sure that that didn't happen to you last night. Anyone? How do you know that you're the same person you were yesterday? Well, let's put it this way. Let's start with a vote. How many of you think you know you are the same person you were yesterday? Raise your hand if you think you're the same person you were yesterday. Okay, so you have this belief that you're the same person you were yesterday. How do you know that? How do you know this isn't really true, and yesterday you were a completely different person who wasn't a UCLA student, who had no interest in psychology whatsoever? Not that all of you actually have an interest in psychology. So how do you know? You have memories. Okay, well, they have memories. They're just implanted memories. Right? And guess what? Implanted memories, they're coming. That'll happen. Right? That'll happen. Yeah. Oh, your notebook has notes in it. You mean the one they wrote for you while you were asleep last night? Yep. Anyone else? Yeah. What? You didn't get rich. Yeah, but yesterday you were rich. You were on the opposite end of the bargain. See, some people get rich, other people get less rich. Yeah, actually, yesterday you had a Nobel Prize. Maybe tomorrow you will again, but today, that's the way it works. Anyone else? Yeah. It doesn't make sense to worry about it. So if any of you really believed you might not be the same person you were yesterday, would you worry about that? Right? If someone said, if like the Surgeon General came to me and said, Matt, we got to talk to you. We think there's a 50% chance you're not the same person you were yesterday. Okay? I'd like to think that you'd be pretty freaked out about that. I think the real truth is that you don't believe there's any chance this is what happened to you. Right? But my question is not that, but rather, what is your evidence? What leads you to believe that you're the same person who went to sleep yesterday? Right, so many witnesses, so many different things that you'd have to change. But, they can freeze time. So they can do that. Right? Or maybe everyone else is in on it. What was that movie with Jim Carrey? Truman Show? Right? So, maybe it's the Truman Show combined with Dark City. It's hard to know. We do live near Hollywood. Things happen. Anyone else? Yeah, in the back. Yeah, you have pictures from yesterday. They have pictures in there too. They're really great at staging pictures of you from your childhood, except the kid in the pictures isn't actually you at all. It's just the kid that you now have a memory of looking like, because they implant that. So the point here is, and I'm happy to go on if someone thinks that they can sort of trump this, but the truth is that the things we use to know that we're the same person we were yesterday, none of those things are things we can be sure of. Because all memory is fallible. We remember things that didn't happen. We all have memories of things that we didn't directly experience or didn't experience the way we think we did. And we also lose memories for lots of things that did happen, right? Most of what we experience, we lose the conscious memory of. Right? So, for my money, I think it's a very interesting thing that we can see something like this and on some logical level acknowledge that I can't really prove why that isn't true. And yet, most of what we're doing here today is being done based on what we believe to be sort of an enduring set of goals about where we want to get to in the future. So like if you're sitting here today thinking, well, the reason I'm doing the things I'm doing is because I want to go to med school someday, and I want to go to med school so that I can, have a lot of prestige or be respected or be able to support a family, or my parents were doctors and that's important to me. If any of those things are there, if we thought today was the first time those things occurred to us, right, that would be very different than our belief that, no, these are the goals I've had for years. Right? We've been defined by the projects we have for the future based on these enduring projects we've had over the past X number of years. So it should be awfully troubling to us if we can't be sure that any of that is true, and yet no one is ever troubled by this. Okay? It's a very interesting paradox. When push comes to shove, we can't be sure that anything we're thinking or feeling today is an actual continuation of a self that was here yesterday, and yet we are built to continue as if it doesn't matter. We're built to continue to ignore this kind of possibility. As the woman in the back said, it wouldn't make much sense to worry about it. Now, I think it actually would make a lot of sense to worry about it for yourself, but from an evolutionary perspective, if you were building a species, you would not want them worrying about something like that, because then everyone would just get stuck ruminating about, I don't know who I am. Right? Evolution doesn't work well if everyone's always having identity crises, and that's what this would cause. And there's a theme that I'll come back to here, which is some of the ways that we're built are not necessarily the best ways for ourselves personally, but we're built in certain ways that are good for society, good for the group more generally. And some of the things that we think are intimately, personally, our own self aspects are sometimes things that really, when you look at them closely, seem to serve the group more than the individual. Okay? So when I talk about this, I refer to it sometimes as one of the nightmares of the self. Okay? The Matrix was another example like this. The first Matrix was kind of the nightmare of the self. The second and third Matrix movies were just nightmares. I was so in love with that first movie, and boy, did they disappoint me. So today I'm going to be talking about the self, and largely what philosophers have had to say about the self over the last 2,500 years. Okay? And what I hope to show you is there is no consensus on what the self is, how it works, when it works, what it does. But these very smart people over the last 2,500 years have had interesting things to say that should make you stop and think. Think about what you do and don't know about the self. My goal is not to tell you, that Hume was right and Plato was wrong. Okay? I'm not going to endorse any of the positions. I think they all have something interesting to say. And as I mentioned, this is the one lecture where you actually need to know the names of the people on the exam. Okay? And that's because it's very hard to refer to their ideas without using their name to refer to them, because you can't describe the study they did, because philosophers don't do studies. So this is the one where you need to know that. And if you come to me later and say, hey, you told us we didn't have to know any names, I'll have this little bit of video sitting on my computer in my office so that I can show you, look, I said it right now. And I told you that I was going to do this and put this on my desktop. Because see, here I am now saying that part too. Okay. So we're going to break up the history of what philosophers have had to say roughly into a couple of different themes that are broken into different time periods. So we're going to go mostly chronologically here, and we're going to start back at the beginning and discuss the relation of the self to the body. Now, it's important to note that prior to the Middle Ages, philosophers generally used the word soul to refer both to what we currently think of as the soul, if we're talking about that in a religious or spiritual sense, that which might go on to live beyond the body, but also to talk about the psychological self. Okay? So some of the times we're going to see the word soul here, okay, and they are kind of referring to a mix of both. So the earliest philosopher, thinker that we'll just briefly touch on is Democritus. And mostly I mention him because his big contribution was, he said, we are all made of atoms, and that is all there is. There's atoms everywhere, and that's it. So we think of kind of the materialistic, physicalistic view of the mind and body that tends to be dominant today as a modern view. But actually the very first person we're going to be talking about here from 460 BC said it's all physical. There's one kind of thing, and it's all physical. So he talked about atoms, and he believed in the soul, but he thought the soul was literally made of atoms. Socrates, who some think of as kind of the greatest thinker in the history of Western civilization. Socrates, in the context of the self, is probably best known for his very short statement, "Know thyself," in which he is encouraging people to understand who they are and what they are. And he says, the unexamined life is not worth living. Okay, so don't just go be like an animal without reflective consciousness. Think about yourself, who you are, who you want to be. Understand yourself. Okay? And one of the things he came to understand about himself is that the one thing I know is that I know nothing. Okay, this is the guy who's sometimes considered the wisest person in the history of Western civilization. Said his greatest piece of wisdom was knowing what he didn't know. Wow, that sounds a lot like hypothesis 3. Interesting. Okay. Now, next comes Socrates' student, Plato. And Plato, kind of arguing against Democritus, said that the soul, or the mind, is the ruler of the body, distinct from the body, and therefore can live on without the body. So as far as we know, this is the first instance in Western civilization of someone making an argument for dualism. The idea that the mind and body, okay, are separate things. Democritus said the mind and body are all the same because everything is just made of atoms. Plato said, nope, they're separate things, and because they're separate things, when the body dies, the mind or the soul or the self can live on separate from the body. Now, Aristotle comes next, and Aristotle was Plato's student. Okay? And Aristotle tried to do a hybrid of what Democritus and Plato said. He said the self or soul is an emergent quality of the physical body. So he said everything is physical. he agrees with Democritus. Everything is physical, but when you get physical stuff organized in just the right way, you get some new qualities that come out of that organization that wouldn't be there if those same physical things were organized differently. And so he points to, for instance, well, he doesn't, but we can. We can point to hydrogen and oxygen. Right? If you put them together in just the right combination, you get stuff that's wet. You get water. Okay? But if you don't put them together in that combination, you don't get water. So hydrogen and oxygen are not themselves intrinsically wet, but if you put them together the right way, you get something that is. And so his argument was that if you put atoms together the right way, you get something that we call the self, soul, mind, however you want to describe that. They didn't really differentiate. Okay. The other example he gives is that of a violin. Okay. And he talks about how the quality of the sound of a violin is emergent from the way the violin is actually built, the construction that goes into us. And so there's a reason why a Stradivarius sounds different than a lesser violin. It's because of the way the physical stuff has been put together. So the question is he for dualism as well? And he's not. This is actually a very modern view. This probably is the modern view of, quote, the mind-body relationship. And the modern view, which is the same as Aristotle's view, I think, is that there is only physical stuff. There is no mental realm. There is no non-physical realm. But that if you put the physical stuff together the right way, you get the properties that we associate with mind. You get something that is experiencing and self-reflective. Okay. And so he doesn't think that there's two different realms, the physical and the non-physical, but rather the physical realm, when put together the right way, can give rise to other properties like the self, the soul, the mind. Okay. So these are the earliest folks, and you can see here that Aristotle does not fully agree with his teacher Plato, and it turns out that one way to get famous is to disagree with your teacher, because it's kind of like, oh, cool, little fight there. Now we'll move on. Okay, now we're basically jumping, deep into the Dark Ages and coming out of the other end of the Dark Ages, because during the Dark Ages, no one said anything interesting. Okay, people just rode around on horses, hit each other with swords, did that for about 1,000 years, and then we get to the other end when they start thinking about the self again. And here we have some philosophers and thinkers who are talking about the temporal aspects of the selves, and temporal just means time, things related to time. Temporal, tempo. St. Thomas Aquinas came up with the famous phrase tabula rasa. What does tabula rasa mean? Everybody learns that much Latin. Everybody knows those two words mean those two words. Everyone seems to learn that. So the implication of tabula rasa is that when we are born, we are a blank slate. There is no soul yet. There is no self yet. And he says the soul enters the body through experience over time. Not all at once. It's something that happens over time as you experience more and more of the world. So if this is the case, one could argue that this is the first account of the self that gives a place in the core of the self for social influence, for the social world getting in and affecting yourself. Because if it comes in through experience, well, then I guess it depends on what kind of experience you have. If you have an experience of living here in Los Angeles versus growing up, in the middle of India, those are going to be different experiences and give rise to different kinds of selves, minds, souls, and so on. 400 years later, John Locke, which if you watch Lost, the character Locke, is based on, not based on, is named after Locke. In fact, at some point they had another character, I think named Hobbes or something, and that's another philosopher. The French woman, right, Rousseau. But no, there was someone else who came along in like season 4 or 5 who also had another philosopher's name. Anyway, John Locke, who thought he was in a hairband, everyone back then did, he said, somewhat famously, that as far as consciousness can extend backwards in time to any past action or thought, so far reaches the identity of that person. Okay? So it is our capacity to think back on those experiences that we've had that made us who we are that continue to allow us to have that identity. And we've already sort of discussed this because we know that amnesics seem to maintain the same identity even though they cannot remember, at least consciously remember, their past actions, their past behaviors, their past experiences. So we know that this statement isn't fully true, but I think what is interesting and important about it is that this is a statement that most of us feel is true. We identify with this statement. We identify intimately with our memories for our past experiences. Okay? So whether you technically need your past memories to maintain your identity, we are attached to those memories as what we believe to be a core part of our identity. Okay? So there's two things that have been written that I like to point people to here if they're interested in these sorts of things. There's two books. The first is Alan Lightman's book, Einstein's Dreams, which actually has almost nothing to do with Einstein, so don't worry if you don't like physics. It's really more of a kind of a set of fairy tales for adults. And in each of the stories in this book, and the stories are usually about 3 pages long, and the book is only about this high, so it's little. Okay? In each of these stories, Lightman changes some fundamental characteristic about the way the world works, and then he sort of plays out how this would change our everyday lives. And in one of them, he creates a town where no one has any memories. No one has memories. And they know they don't have memories. Okay? All they can remember are the events of that single day. And when they go to sleep and wake up, those memories will be gone. Okay? And what's very interesting about this is how people choose to spend their time in this town, in this city. See, some people are so attached to the idea of their memories of what they've done before that when they get home from work and they have a few hours left at the end of the day, they spend their entire time before they go to sleep writing down the events of the day and reading the events of their past so that they can get some glimpse into who they have been over the course of their life. Other people, on the other hand, have completely abandoned trying to remember who they were because the book that you write just gets longer and longer and you can't be reading it in any substantive way anyway, and when you go to sleep you're going to forget it all, so you'd have to do it again tomorrow. And so these people, he describes, they come home from work, they find their spouse there and they introduce themselves because they don't remember ever meeting before, but they spend each night as if it was the first night they've ever met, and they fall in love every night again and again and again, not worrying about who they were in the past. And again, I'm not endorsing going out and getting amnesia, but there are different ways that we can treat memories as they relate to our own identity and ourselves and our attachment to those beliefs and memories. Italo Calvino was an Italian writer. He died 10, 12 years ago, and he wrote a bunch of books that are just awesome. If you're really a reader, go get the book, If on a Winter's Night a Traveler. It will confuse and astound you, but it's really, really a wonderful, wonderful book. But then he's written these other books of short stories, and I believe this short story comes from a collection of stories called Difficult Loves. Okay, and the title of the story, whichever book it came from, is called The Adventure of a Photographer. And it's about this guy who's part of a group of friends where they all seem to get cameras around the same time. And this is back before people had digital cameras. Okay? And they all get cameras, and they start sort of getting excited about taking pictures of everything in their lives. And they do all these things together. And they take all these pictures, and they get frustrated that, the pictures don't seem to be capturing the reality very well. So they really want to be diligent about this, and so they start taking more and more pictures to try to capture the reality. And they realize they're still not getting what they felt like they were experiencing in the moment. So they start doing things like, if they're trying to take pictures of a volleyball game that they're having, okay, they actually stop playing volleyball and they stage volleyball scenes. And then they take a picture of the volleyball scene and they look at the picture and they go, yeah, that's just what it was like. Okay? And so what they start doing is staging all the things that they otherwise would actually be doing in order to take pictures that will then capture the memory of things that never actually occurred. Okay? And this is not something that's totally fiction. Typically when you look at photos from any book that shows pictures of, say World War II, World War I, almost all the pictures that seem to show battle scenes are staged reenactments. Okay? They don't typically have photographers who are sitting there while the actual fighting is going on going, smile. Right? Those things might be taken the same day, but maybe later after the actual fighting has taken place. And so it creates this kind of paradox where you can either essentially be creating the real experience itself or trying to capture that experience in a way that seems to contaminate or altogether replace the experience itself. And we do a lot of things in our lives where we try to create future memories by setting something up the right way right now. So for instance, a big part of planning a wedding is about creating a day and an event that a photographer will be able to capture, that you will be able to look back on in 30 years and say that was, the perfect day, assuming you're still married to that person. 50-50 odds, right? So this is interesting. It's also interesting in light of the fact of the ways, photography has changed, because we do have digital cameras. When I was a kid, you had to pay $5 for a roll of film and another $5 or something to develop the film. And it took weeks to find out what those pictures look like. And so I, probably from my childhood, from 0 to 3 years old, there might be like 150 pictures total. Okay? Because that's what people did back then. Okay? When my son turned 2, I took more than 150 pictures on his birthday. Okay? And I can select out the 3 pictures that were awesome, and I post those on my Facebook page, and that's what all my family and friends will see as that day. That's what it looked like on that day. Okay? But when you only have 150 pictures, and some of them are blurry and this and that, you still cherish every one, because it's all you got. Okay? It's a very different way to think about creating these memories when there's constantly pictures being taken of everything we do all the time. All right, so next we have John Butler. Now, John Butler was not a famous philosopher, and just to give you an idea of just how not famous John Butler was, this is the only picture I could find of John Butler. So this is John Butler of the John Butler Trio. There are no photographs, paintings, statues of John Butler, so we're just going to have to imagine this guy lived in the 1700s. Okay. Again, in a hairband, that's right. And he said the following, I think, rather controversial thing. He said, the self is not a permanent but a transient thing. Remember, we're talking about time here. The self is not a permanent but a transient thing, that it lives and dies, begins and ends continually. It is a fallacy upon ourselves to charge our present selves with anything we did, or to imagine our present selves interested in what will befall us tomorrow, since our present self is not, in reality, the same with the self of yesterday, but another like self or person coming into its room, mistaken for it, to which another self will succeed tomorrow. Okay, now, on the face of it, this is absolutely ridiculous. Right? It is. Nobody can walk out of here truly, truly believing this. But this is not that far off from what Dark City, that clip I was showing you, was suggesting. And there are some ways we behave in everyday life that suggest there's something true about this in our psychology, in the way we treat ourselves. So my favorite example of this is, I'll just give myself as an example. I hate to throw stones. That's my dad calling. It is. So, I was at a conference 2 weeks ago, and Megan was there. We were at a conference for social neuroscientists, and, I don't go out drinking all that much anymore. I have a 2-year-old. I've got enough stuff, in my life. But when we go to conferences, it's kind of a lab tradition that we go out and we go out. So, so there was a lot of alcohol involved, and perhaps more importantly, a lot of different kinds of alcohol involved. If you start with beer, it's good to stick with beer, but it's not good to go through 7 different kinds of alcohol in one night. And so, of course, when I woke up 4 hours later to go catch my flight back to Los Angeles, I was in agony. Okay, and this is a familiar feeling, I'm sure, to many of you, and in tomorrow morning it will be a very familiar feeling for about half of you. Okay? And the interesting thing is that when you're doing all that drinking, when you're going from one alcohol to the next, you don't care about the self that's waking up tomorrow. You don't care at all. It's like somebody else is going to wake up tomorrow, and I'll be gone. I'm the one who gets to have fun right now. I get to enjoy all the benefits of the alcohol, and some poor sucker is going to wake up in my bed tomorrow, and he's the guy who's going to have to suffer. Okay? Imagine if things were set up such that whenever I drank, somebody else got a hangover. Okay? That'd be awesome. Be like, hey, look, I'm sorry that you're the person who got stuck to me, but I'm going to go drink now, and good luck. Drink some water tonight. But that's kind of how we treat our future selves. So obviously we're not disinterested in our future selves altogether. We do lots of things to make sure that our future selves will have the career and the family and all that we want. But there are times when we act as if the future self is irrelevant. When we break our diets, when we do all sorts of things for the moment, for the momentary pleasures, without consideration of the person who's going to suffer some consequence as a result of that. On the flip side, when we look back at our past selves, there can be a real separation there as well. So, if I have an argument with my wife, and we don't argue very often, but when we do, right, we argue, and I'm like, hey, look, I didn't do anything wrong. I did not. You're wrong. I'm wrong. You're wrong. Nope, you're wrong. You're wrong. I'm right. You're wrong. And a couple days later, invariably, I figure out I was wrong. Okay, but it takes a couple days. Right? There was that song 10 years ago, 1 week, right, where you talk about how long it takes you before you can admit that you were wrong about something. And when you go back to apologize, you sort of are saying, I don't know why that guy a week ago did the stupid things he did, but you can forgive me because I'm not that guy. Right? I don't know what's wrong with that guy, but I'm not him. I'm a different guy, so you can trust me to not do the stupid things that he did. Right? That's essentially what we do when we ask for an apology. And we need a certain amount of separation from ourselves in the past before we can be detached enough to say, I'm not that guy, so I can say he did something stupid without my having to really fully take responsibility for it now. I can just say, I'm a different guy. Okay? So both when we think about our future and our past selves, okay, there are these ways that we're sort of detached some of the time from those other selves. And so it does raise this really bizarre question of whether the self has a duration. That just sounds incoherent. That's like saying, what color is the self? How long is the self? Right? It doesn't make any sense, and yet there are aspects of the self that suggest that there is kind of a temporal coming and going of certain components of the self. And William James actually wrote about this extensively back in 1890 and said there is a duration to the self. He referred to it as the specious present. That won't be on any exam. Okay? But he talks about how sort of things affect us in the immediate moment, and then both going off into the future and the past become less and less self-connected. All right. Now, our next group of philosophers really do what philosophers should do, and they just focus on whether the damn thing even exists at all. Okay, that's what philosophers say. They say, how do you know your chair is here? Right? If a tree fell in the forest. Hopefully you know the second half of that. No? Okay. So the most famous person from this line of thinking is René Descartes, who very, 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 very famously said, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. Okay? He went through this long meditation where he doubted all the things he could possibly doubt. And it's sort of the same story that's in the Matrix, right? Maybe I'm just a brain in a vat. Maybe all the experiences I'm having aren't really my experiences. But ultimately, he said, the one thing I cannot doubt is that there is doubting going on right now. There's no way to get rid of that. There is something doubting, experiencing, thinking. Now, he went on to then say, and that thing is me as I currently understand myself, because he basically said after that, God is a good God and he wouldn't deceive me. Okay, it's kind of a cop-out, I think. But the general idea that you can't doubt without actually engaging in doubt at that very moment, and therefore something experiential exists, I think is legit. The other problem with René Descartes and this statement is that it was hardly as original as he was given credit for. So over 1,000 years before him, St. Augustine wrote, whether I'm asleep or awake, it is I who is one of these, and therefore I exist. And Descartes read St. Augustine. So, good for René Descartes. He turned out to be wrong about everything else, so we can give him credit for that. Now, what René Descartes said, and the argument he gave for the soul and the self being roughly what we experience it as being, set the stage for what everyone else was going to react to over the next couple hundred years in this debate about whether the self exists or not. So David Hume, 100 years after Descartes, wrote the following. And this is kind of a very inflammatory statement for a philosopher, and it really shook things up and bothered lots and lots and lots of people, because it wasn't the conclusion anyone wanted to hear. He wrote, there are some philosophers who imagine we are every moment intimately conscious of what we call our self. For my part, when I enter most intimately into what I call myself, I always stumble on some particular perception of other of heat or cold, light or shade, love or hatred, pain or pleasure. I never can catch myself at any time without a perception, and never observe anything but the perception. I may venture to affirm of the rest of mankind that they are nothing but a bundle or collection of different perceptions which succeed each other with an inconceivable quickness and are in perpetual flux and movement. Okay. So his conclusion, David Hume's conclusion, is there is no such thing as the self. And you are all deluded. All you philosophers and all you non-philosophers who think you have a self, prove it, because you don't. And so let's do a little exercise right now. Everybody close your eyes. Okay? And I'm going to give you a moment here. And what I'd like you to do in that moment is find yourself. Go. Okay, open your eyes. Who found themselves? It's always 2 or 3 people who raise their hands and say, I found myself. No, you didn't. Come on. Okay? When you go into that thought, you notice sounds, you notice perceptions of different things, you notice yourself noticing, right? But all you notice is the noticing. You don't notice the noticer. You don't notice an entity that's doing all the perceiving, feeling, thinking. You notice thoughts, feelings, sensory reactions, okay, but never the person who's having those. Okay. This pissed off so many people back in 1740. It took a little while to spread. The internet wasn't quite invented yet, but it did spread, and it really bothered people. Yep. Right. Who is the person? So our general feeling is that we have this core self, this thing that essentially is the core of our psychological experience, the thing that experiences the world, and that it's somehow separate from our bodies. Right? There's no particular part of our body where we think, well, if I cut off my finger, I'm not me anymore. I don't have myself. We tend to locate our experience of self as being, roughly speaking, behind the eyes, which also happens to be where your brain is, but there's no sensory experience of the brain itself. There are no sensory neurons in the brain, only neurons that detect sensation in the rest of the body. And so the idea is that we talk about the self as if it's this reified thing. We talk about myself as if, here's my Diet Coke, and somewhere over here is myself. Okay, I got this one at 7-Eleven. I don't know where I got this one, but I'm keeping it. Okay? And what he's saying is, that's an illusion. All we know that you have are different particular experiences. And it is an illusion that we say there is something that binds all those different experiences together into one self. Okay, there is no coherent center. There's just all those things, because that's all we ever directly know about. Okay, so following Hume, Immanuel Kant, who is largely considered to be sort of the smartest philosopher of the sort of couple hundred years around this period, but also just about the most confusing philosopher too, which might suggest, and I don't think this is entirely wrong, that the more confusing you can be, the fewer people who can understand you, the more they will proclaim just how brilliant you are. He actually used to say, Immanuel Kant, that he didn't want simple people to understand him. Okay? He also never left the town he was born in. He was born in, I think, a small town called Königsberg, Germany. Never left it his whole life. Okay, afraid of planes. That's the problem. So Kant reacts to Hume pretty directly. Okay? And his argument is, as most of us would like to believe, he says, the true self exists, but it is not directly knowable. See, Kant talks about two classes of things in the universe. He talks about noumena and phenomena. Okay? You use the word phenomena, phenomenon all the time. Here's where it came from. He invented the word. Okay? Kant invented it. And he said noumena are all the real things of the world that we can never know directly. And all we know are our perceptions of the world. Those are our experience of phenomena. And he is acknowledging that the way the mind works determines how we experience the world. There isn't color out in the world. The world that we can't actually see directly impinges on us, and then our brain turns that into an experience of a particular kind. Okay? Kant's also considered the grandfather of cognitive psychology, because he said we have different mental faculties that basically convert however the world impinges on us into particular experiences. Okay? And so he said all we ever know are phenomena, and the self is noumena. It's not phenomena. Okay? So the phenomena are all the different things you can find when Hume tells you to go find yourself. So the phenomena are the experience of cold or dark or light, or of math being computed in your head. Those are all the phenomena, but Kant says we can infer and accurately infer that there has to be a core thing binding them together, the true self. And he gives an analogy. His analogy is one of symptoms versus diseases. Okay? He said most of the time, when someone has a disease, all we actually get to see are the symptoms. So for instance, if someone has Lyme's disease, which is something you get from a deer tick, and it's awful if you get it, there will typically be a rash around the area that the deer tick bit you, but it could be a really big rash, not just a little tiny little bug bite kind of thing. You can get really bad headaches. You can get arthritis in joints that aren't close to where the bug bite happened. Okay? And then you can actually have heart problems that go along with this. Now, none of these symptoms are the disease itself, but it's this collection of symptoms that can lead a doctor to say there is an underlying disease. And the underlying disease doesn't just mean that's a renaming of the symptoms. It means there's something that gives rise to those symptoms. Okay? And so when you want to treat a disease, whenever you can, you try to treat the core disease itself, and if you can treat that, the symptoms will go away. When we can't get at the core disease itself, we treat the symptoms, like with the common cold. Right? We treat the symptoms, sometimes not so well, stuffy nose, sore throat, whatever, because we don't know how to treat the disease, but sometimes we do. And so there can be things like diseases that we don't know directly, but we know them only through their symptoms that we can see in the world. So the symptoms are like noumena, which are like the true self, and, symptoms are like phenomena, which are like the things that we sort of see happening in our own minds, our experiences of light, cold, heat, so on. Disease is like the noumena and the true self. Okay? So he said we know the self through its effects, okay, through its symptoms. And Daryl Bem, who's a modern social psychologist, has a theory that's very similar to this. He said oftentimes the way we know ourselves is through what he calls self-perception processes. And when Daryl Bem talks about self-perception processes, he doesn't mean you can look inward and see your true self, but rather that we see the effects of our self out in the world all the time. See, right now I'm doing something. I'm up here lecturing to all of you, okay? And I'm aware that there's this person here who's doing this lecturing, and while I'm doing that, or later when I think back about doing that, that affects how I understand myself. Okay? He gives a very specific example. He says, imagine that you're in the dentist waiting room, and the dentist is going to be doing some really nasty procedure. It's going to involve pain. Okay? And you're sitting there, and you're not aware of whether or not you're anxious or not, but you look down and you notice that your foot is tapping 1,000,000 miles a minute. And then that makes it occur to you, wow, maybe I'm really anxious about what's coming up. So he said sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes the way we come to know ourselves is by watching ourselves the same way that we watch other people. See, because if you were in that waiting room and you saw someone else tapping their foot like that, you would think they're nervous or anxious about something. And he said that's how we come to know ourselves, through our effects, through our manifestations in the world. So Kant would argue that the self is real, but never known directly. Now, I'm not suggesting Hume or Kant is right. Okay? It would take me a long time to give you my opinion on that, but that's not what's important. What's important is, I think these are very interesting perspectives that yield very different conclusions about what kind of creatures we are. And the fact that we can be the kind of creatures that even think about what people like Hume and Kant have to say about what kind of creatures we are. Now, if Kant has a leg to stand on here, if Daryl Bem is right, okay, we can say, well, how do we come to know ourselves? Okay, and one of the metaphors that I've used to make sense of this perspective that I think is useful is thinking of yourself kind of like a flashlight, right? Your eyes kind of take in what's going on around you in the same way that a flashlight illuminates lots of stuff. And flashlights are great, right? If the room is dark, you can shine a flashlight on anything and it lets you see it really clearly. Okay? But what's the one thing you can't illuminate with a flashlight? Itself. Right? You can't get the flashlight, no matter how you turn it, to light itself. And so I think that that might be something like what's going on in terms of the actual self, relative to the things that it can light up and show us, the effects of the flashlight on the world. But one of the interesting things here, tying all of this back to social psychology, is that if you do want to be able to use a flashlight and shine it on itself, the way you do that, right, is by shining it into a mirror. And I think social psychologists would argue that other people essentially serve as mirrors for us. So other people are the way we reflect back our actions to ourselves. So a lot of the time we're running around sort of pre-reflectively just doing without thinking about ourselves. And then somebody else can watch us and say, you know, you're the kind of person who does this. And you might have never noticed that. But when they point it out to you, you might go, you know, now that you say that, maybe I am that kind of person. Okay, so other people, I would argue, can sometimes know more about us than we know about ourselves. Okay? I certainly count on the people around me in my life to sometimes know more about me than myself. Okay? And if you have good friends or if you're in a very serious relationship, you've probably had this experience, kind of if you're honest about what you do and don't know about yourself. People are in some ways better at observing what's true of others than they are of observing what's true of themselves. Okay, so moving on. Now we're moving into the modern age. Starting to move into the modern age. I think the 1800s really have a lot more in common with the 1900s and today in terms of our experience of the world, of globalization, of the way things were really changing pace. This is when technology really became an important part of society, industrialization, and so on. We're going to come back to that in a little bit. That actually ends up being important for understanding what the self is. But here we're going to talk about two particular philosophers who were both friends and enemies. Frenemies. Okay. So the first of these is the philosopher. Okay. Oh, you know what? I want to read you, before we do this, I'll read you this quote from Roy Baumeister, who's a current important psychologist. We've actually already talked about some of his studies. But he gave a really nice quote talking about Kant and Hume in a paper he wrote on the self. And he wrote, Kant said, agreeing with Hume, that you cannot perceive yourself directly. However, the act of perceiving something in the world can itself become perceived. So you perceive the act of perceiving and get some information about the self that way. The self is not perceived, but the activity of the self is perceived, and one can learn about the self from that. All right, well, I guess I already said that, but I think Roy says it more succinctly. Okay, so Arthur Schopenhauer. Kind of looks like someone at war with himself, doesn't he? Doesn't look like a real happy guy there. Who was the sidekick in Gump? What was his name? I think this guy could be played by him. There was a movie. What? Lieutenant Dan. Yeah, the other guy. He's on a TV show, one of the NCI or whatever TV shows. Gary Sinise. There you go. All right. So his most famous work, okay, is called The World as Will and Idea. Okay? And what he was talking about, he was really the first philosopher, I think, to talk in a deep way about this, is he said there's two fundamental components to the self, and they're at war with each other. Okay? He said there's the part of the self that we kind of share with most of the other animals in the animal kingdom, and he referred to this as will. We can think of it as motivation. Okay? And he said each self is the objectification of the one will to live, and it strives to assert its own existence at the expense of other things. Now, I don't want you to get caught up on objectification of the one will to live. Okay, that's a little bit, I think, of hooey, but the idea here is that we're very, very motivated to do what's best for us at the expense of others. There's this intense kind of, what are my needs? What are my goals? I'm going to survive. I'm going to get mine. Right? I'm going to get gold-plated teeth, whatever it is. That's for me. Right? I don't care about any of you. And this can lead us to do lots of horrible, tragic things to each other. Okay? But he said humans, fortunately, have this other half to their self, to their soul, which he referred to as the idea. And he said, in aesthetic contemplation, man transcends his slavery to the will. So he's basically saying, through reflective thinking, we can think about our future and past selves, we can think about who we want to be, who we aspire to be, and who we don't want to be, and we can try to rein in our will such that we can be a better person. And so he said there's an ongoing struggle between these two parts of ourselves. Between the part, that just wants to run around naked and drunk all the time never work, never do anything useful or constructive for society, and the part that can listen to opera and not fall asleep. I don't have that part. I'm kidding. But the part that can sort of lead us to be better selves through thought, through reflection. And so he said the will degrades us, but the idea saves us. Okay? So he clearly thinks the will is that base animalistic part of us that is not a good thing to have, and thank goodness for the will, which allows us to rise above that and be noble creatures. Okay? Now, he was a famous philosopher in the 1840s, okay, and for decades after that. Actually, if you're thinking about this and you've read Freud, you might go, "Oh, that sounds a little bit like the id and the superego." Okay, and that's because Freud stole it from Schopenhauer. Okay, so Freud, when he got really, really famous, philosophers said, the stuff you're saying, it sounds a bit like Schopenhauer. And they did live about 100 miles apart from each other. And Freud said, "Schopen who? I don't know any Schopenhauer." "What? I don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, that's interesting that he says some things that are vaguely similar to what I've said, but I'm so much more right than he is." After Freud died, they found copies of Schopenhauer's works basically hidden under his bed. Okay? And in the columns, in the margins, were annotations of all these sections that referred to, what Freud later wrote, or what Freud had written that made him so famous, talking about these divisions of the self, of the soul, and so on. I don't mean to suggest that Freud didn't have something important to contribute, but it seems like he did get quite a bit of this from reading Schopenhauer and did not appropriately cite his sources, as the APA manual would suggest. Now, around this same time, a couple decades after, Schopenhauer was this very important philosopher, and he was sort of part of this group of intellectual and aesthetic elites. Schopenhauer was like best friends with the composer Wagner. Okay, there was this real connection there. This is Germany, so you get the people that are there that are part of kind of the intellectual and cultural elite. And there was this young up-and-coming philosopher that they thought was clever and smart, and so they sort of brought him into the fold and kind of took him out drinking and, taught him the ways of the world. And this new philosopher just idolized Wagner and Schopenhauer. He wrote essays just saying about how these are the most important people in the world. That was until they broke his heart. I know. And you don't even know who I'm talking about, but you feel bad for him. Okay, and he did go crazy eventually, so you should feel bad for him. And when I say crazy, I mean he went crazy, literally. That's how he died. But before he did that, he wrote things where he basically said Schopenhauer and Wagner are the worst people in the world. They got everything wrong. And one of the things that he said Schopenhauer got wrong is he said he got this completely wrong. Okay, so Nietzsche was this young philosopher. Best mustache ever. I think Brad Pitt's going to grow one of those the next time he grows a mustache. And obviously, Nietzsche has gone on to become far more famous than either Schopenhauer or Wagner. Okay? And he talks about essentially the same two motivational forces that Schopenhauer does, but he gives a very different framing to them. He thinks of them in very different ways. And so instead of talking about the will and idea, he talks about the Dionysian and Apollonian forces. He goes back and he talks about, largely he focuses on Greek culture, okay, and how there were essentially groups of people that were kind of Apollonian and Dionysian cults. Okay. The Apollonian cults were essentially the government of every city. They were in charge. And the Dionysian cults were basically these groups that went from town to town, basically making merry. Okay, they went from town to town, bringing alcohol, bringing music, and they would essentially, shut down whatever town they got into for like 3 days. And for 3 days, you would just have like Lollapalooza, and everyone would just be drunk, having sex, and they would wake up with the worst hangover ever. Okay, but this was like the thing to do when the Dionysians showed up in your town. So they were like giant raves, okay, that were kind of endless events. Okay? And these two groups hated each other. And Nietzsche talks about these two groups and the way they represent the warring parts within each individual, the psychology of the individual. Okay? And so he talks about the Dionysian side of the self not as the savage beast within each of us, but rather in terms of the way that we can lose ourselves and kind of fuse with others and the world around us in a way that can be the most fulfilling thing that's part of human nature. Okay, we can lose ourselves to the moment at a concert, dancing, doing, any number of different things. We can lose ourselves in that, and that is when we feel most ourselves, most alive, even though it's when we're losing ourselves. Okay? And he said this is what binds us and connects us to the world when we engage this side of ourselves. Okay? Yep. Freud might have coined the term ego, although it's possible, that Nietzsche might have coined the term ego. It's possible. He certainly talks about the word ego, although I don't know if he was the first one to. But Freud certainly acknowledges more of an influence of Nietzsche on him than he does of Schopenhauer on him. Yeah, no, that's certainly true. And they lived at overlapping periods of time. They did live at overlapping periods of time. So when you're in a Dionysian state, when that part of you is dominating, there's sort of a blurring between you and the rest of the world, between you and whoever you're with in that moment. And one way that I like to think about this is that there's sort of a darkness to the Dionysian, because in the dark, you can't see the distinctions between self and other. Everything kind of merges, and you think of like a concert where it's dark, and you're sort of half blurry and blinded with alcohol or whatever it is, right? And there is kind of a blindness that prevents you from focusing too much on exactly who's doing what. Okay? On the other hand, we have the Apollonian side, okay, which is associated with the Greek god Apollo. Okay? And this side is the side that's associated with the light, okay, with restraint, language, individuation, knowing who's me and who's you and what's the difference between us. What are our relative roles? What are our relative responsibilities? Okay? What categories are each of us in? What categories do we share? What categories differentiate us? Okay? It's all about using those reflective, analytic capacities we have to think about ourselves and the world and set up a system of restraints and paths that are acceptable to take in a particular society. And that's a big part of what the government does, right? The government decides what we're all going to do. The government decides that you're all going to go to school from K to 12. The government decides we're going to give funding to people to do this kind of research rather than this kind of research because we deem that important for society. Not important for the individual, but for society. It's better for society that way. And so when you have sort of intense light, where you can see everything so clearly, you have a clearer distinction between the self and other. Okay? You can scrutinize objects and people and events in much greater detail in the light. Okay? And there's more of a separation and detachment between you and everything else, because you can see the distance between you and everything else, what that is and how it's not me, how it's something other than me. So instead of merging, there's a separation. There's a detachment associated with this aspects. And so when we tell our kids to use their words, reflective processing, right, you're essentially telling them to detach from their more immediate experience, their Dionysian side. And as human beings, we become very adept at this. A lot of our education trains us to do this well. Okay? So you can tell by the language I'm using here, Nietzsche does not think that the Apollonian is the greatest thing in the world. He's not a huge fan. So we're talking about the same two motivational forces that Schopenhauer did, but casting them in a different light. Okay? He thinks this reflects who we really are, and this is what corrupts who we are through the influence of sort of the rules and boundaries that a society sets up for the individual. Okay? And he suggests that we kind of have two motivations that each tap into one of these two forces. The Dionysian motivation is kind of to become one with existence, to become one with everything around us. And this involves kind of accepting and not reflecting on both sort of the horror and beauty of everything about life. Okay? Life fundamentally involves getting older, growing, having pain, having heartache, and dying. Right? True for every person who ever lived. That's the way it ends. That's the way it always ends. The Apollonian is about trying to control this process and not being exposed any more than we have to the negative, gritty, painful aspects of life. But at the same time, Nietzsche would say, this also prevents us from experiencing some of the most profound parts of life as well. Okay? And so he would suggest that the Apollonian, if that dominates too much, it creates a controllable but artificial kind of aesthetic vision of what life can and should be, almost like a virtual reality, where all the pieces are put into place, but there's no actual feeling associated with it. It's just artificial. And ultimately, he suggests you need the two together. Right? The two together are what make a complete, mature adult. You need both. You want to be tapped into sort of the experiential side of things, but the only way to do that effectively over the course of a lifetime and not just burn out and die like really, really quickly is to be thinking about, well, where can I get some more food so that I can go do some more Dionysian stuff tomorrow? Right? So you got to put those things together is what he ultimately says. But he says, and I think he's right about this, that in our society, we're profoundly influenced by the Apollonian side, and as a result of that influence, okay, what we decide will make us happy rarely does. Because what we decide will make us happy is decided on the basis of that Apollonian side of things. Right? This recalls the Tim Wilson study on introspection. Okay? And I just want to show you... No, I will come back to this. So the last thing I want to show you is just this little table that I've made that kind of tells you how sort of the Apollonian and Dionysian sides of ourselves break down in terms of these characteristics on the left. So you can say, okay, where does the Apollonian operate best? It operates best in the light, Dionysian in the dark. Okay? How does it relate to regulation? The Apollonian's more related to regulation, the Dionysian to non-regulation. And we will pick up here next Tuesday. Have a fun weekend. Be good to your future selves. But not too good.